Welcome to the second event of the Papers in Progress Graduate Symposium this year. Second of two events that we have organized this year. The first one was in the fall. Today's is a bit longer. It's about 4 papers spanning the whole day. So we'll start now. We have 2 papers in the morning session, and we stop at 1 o'clock. We'll have a lunch break from 1 to 2, and then we start at 2 and go on until 3:30. Now, I just want to say that this is a new thing we have started in the department to provide a forum for our graduate students to present some work in progress or dissertation chapter or a conference paper. Although, if you think about it, some of my colleagues will recall that this is not altogether new, because when we started this entire Nugent series back in 2008, we did have 2 similar events back in 2009, I think. But for some reason we haven't had similar events recently. So the 2 speakers this morning are Dr. Reeju Ray and Erin Mandzak here, and the commentator is Professor Adnan Hussain of our department. So I'll say quickly a few things about the speakers, and then we'll have one paper roughly for 30 minutes, and the second paper, and then some comments, and then open it up for discussions and questions. Reeju did her PhD from here, from Queens, finished it in September last year. And her dissertation title was Placing the Khasi Jaintiah Hills, Sovereignty, Custom, and Narratives of Continuity. She is primarily a historian of South Asia, mainly interested in questions of sovereignty, identity, and indigeneity. Currently, Reeju is teaching at the Center of South Asian Studies at the University of Toronto, and also as a teaching fellow here at Queens. And apart from her work, which she is now working on to convert into a book manuscript, Reeju has presented in numerous different locations outside North America, in the UK and in India as well. The second speaker is Erin Mandzak here. She's primarily a historian of Canada's relationship with the Caribbean and Canadian cultural history, Caribbean history, critical race theory, and interestingly, history of tourism and world fairs. Today's talk, by the way, the title has changed from the one that you saw in the emails or in the posters. Erin's talk's title is Trade Mutualism and the Longing for a Tropical Empire, Canada and the Caribbean, 1912 to 1935. Erin is a 5th-year PhD student at the department, currently working on a dissertation entitled The Imperial Contours of Canada's Transnational Relationship with the Caribbean, Trade, Tourism, Diplomacy, Immigration, Regulation, Development Aid, and National Spectacles, 1912 to 1967. Erin did her bachelor's from U of T and her master's from York University, and currently finishing up her dissertation here at Queens. I'll also say a few words about our commentator this morning, Professor Hussain. He's one of the 2 Queens National Scholars in our history department. She's a historian of medieval Mediterranean world, and apart from her wide-ranging interests in research, teaching, and supervising, she's also the co-director of the speaker series, which means she is one of the co-organizers of today's event. So with that, I think we'll start, and I'll chair this session, Reeju, roughly about 30 minutes, then we'll have a second paper.
Could you point out when it's about 5 minutes? Thanks. My paper is titled Interrupted Sovereignties and Colonial Frontiers, the Khasi Jaintiah Hills, circa 1778 to 1874. I'm just going to point out a couple of key dates. In 1765, the East India Company attained Diwani rights, or the right to collect revenue in Bengal, and began its administrative career in the subcontinent. In 1778, Sylhet, the easternmost district of Bengal, was made into a separate collectorate under Robert Lindsay. His appointment was followed by the transformation of jungle, swamps, and unoccupied stretches of land into potential revenue-yielding land. In 1793, decades of territorialization in Bengal culminated in the permanent settlement, which gave proprietary rights in land to a class of Bengali zamindars who were earlier revenue collectors. It fixed the revenue that the British would collect from the zamindars and restructured the earlier taxation system in Bengal. Between 1820s to 1830s, treaties were signed with chiefs or CMs of several autonomous polities that had remained outside the purview of Mughal administration. In 1857, the British Crown replaced the East India Company as Government of India, and in 1874, new forms of treaties were signed between Khasi chiefs and the East India Company, confirming the dominant or affirming the dominant political role of the latter and the purely customary role of the former. Many studies have used the framework of indirect rule to describe the nature of colonialism in autonomous polities like the Khasi Jaintiah Hills. I contend that colonial power operated directly in extra-imperial spaces through colonial knowledge production, jurisdiction, and legislations, and by creating distinctions between politics and custom or culture. So what was really indirect about colonialism in extra-imperial spaces? The violence on local knowledge forms, subject formation, the ascription of a marginal status to the region and its inhabitants, and the reconstituted ruler-subject relations had a profound and direct effect on the inhabitants of the Khasi Jaintiah Hills. The hills, in turn, radically challenged, resisted, and interrupted colonial power. This map of eastern Bengal shows the Khasi Jaintiah Hills right in the center. The yellow spot in the center is the Khasi Jaintiah Hills. This is a map from 1909. So it's at a time when a lot of the northeast frontier had been directly taken over by this colonial state. Although there were, as you can see, pockets of autonomous and semi-autonomous polities that remained. This paper examines the nature of imperial sovereignty in the northeast frontier of the British Empire in India. Polities that constituted the Khasi Jaintiah Hills represent interruptions in imperial sovereignty. Over the course of the 19th century, reconstituted notions of sovereignty emerged for both the British and Khasi, each informing, limiting, and interrupting the other. Dual processes of incorporating the hills into a colonial frontier space and the unresolved nature of such discursive constructions demonstrate the contending nature of sovereignty in the imperial frontier. I argue that formulations of imperial sovereignty in Bengal, which was the heart of the early British Empire in India, emerged in relation to territories described as non-British or extra-imperial. This argument is part of a much larger project, and I will only be able to focus on a small but significant aspect, which is the process of drawing boundaries between British and non-British territories in the frontier and their persistent undoing. Boundaries of civilization, revenue, and jurisdiction. Natural boundaries like rivers were used to define frontiers in pre-colonial Bengal between the British Empire and other dynastic powers and smaller autonomous polities. This practice was replicated by the early colonial survey operations. However, colonial officials failed to comprehend that political and territorial definitions in the pre-colonial period were not precise but overlapping, therefore producing fluid boundaries between different sovereign powers. In the last few years, historians like David Ludden, Sanghamitra Mishra, and Gunal Sederloff have emphasized the imprecision of political frontiers in the pre-colonial period. This was a result of overlapping sovereignties of corresponding or neighboring political powers. The power of one ruler or dynasty merged imperceptibly into the territories of another and were gradually overshadowed by the power of the other. Thus, the emerging association between topography and political and cultural forms in the colonial period was always already imperfect. The imperfection and incompleteness characterized 19th century geographical and legal discourse on the frontier. The territorial demarcation of Khasi territory as mountainous, carefully excluding inhabitants of Khasi polities at the foothills and lowlands of Sylhet was a step towards creating an artificial distinction between the political and social continuities between the hills and the plains. In 1787, Robert Lindsay, collector of the district of Sylhet in Bengal, wrote, the Kosiyas that inhabit that tract of mountainous country extending from Laur, the northwest extremity of Sylhet, to the eastern boundary of Kachar. The mountains, according to Reynolds' calculations, are 1,200 yards high and inaccessible to a foreign enemy, and every part of them are beyond the country's provinces. Drawing boundaries between Khasi Hills and Sylhet became increasingly important during the second decade of the 19th century. In the earlier decades, raids by mountaineers, as they were called, were created as the one problem faced by the company and the subjects in the Bengal plains. And this further necessitated the drawing of boundaries. This process of drawing boundaries and spatially kind of separating the hills and plains led to the construction of the Khasi as a hill tribal on the one hand, and also enabled the colonial government to extend jurisdiction into extra-imperial spaces or Khasi polities by signing treaties with Khasi chiefs through the 1820s and 30s. Boundary making accompanied late 18th and early 19th century geographical knowledge production, formulating imperial sovereignty in regions outside of the scope of the company governance, produced anxieties that were visible in the revenue and jurisdictional boundaries that were being drawn on the one hand, and civilizational classifications such as tribals versus caste groups, etc., that were made on the other. I will quickly discuss a survey conducted in Sylhet and its vicinity, which aimed at creating a rigid boundary between the Sylhet plains, which were considered Khasi, British territory, and the hills considered non-British territory. In 1835, Francis Jenkins commented that it seems he was the agent to the Governor General in the Northeast Frontier. He said, it seems expedient that the question of boundary should be decisively arranged early, for the present want of a determined frontier keeps the borders in a very unsettled state and may lead to breaches of peace. These breaches continued into the following decades because the territorial boundaries marked by the British in their early surveys were unable to establish where the hills really ended. Disputes between the proprietors who settled in Sylhet, their subjects, and the subjects of the Khasi polities who had been using the Sylhet lowlands for agriculture, grazing, and other purposes demonstrate the contentious nature of territorial and topographical distinctions. Lieutenant Thomas Fisher's survey of 1827-28 became the focal point of many discussions and disputes, political and judicial, until the 1870s. The survey was supplemented by a specific report on the boundary between the Khasi Hills and Sylhet, addressed to the magistrate of Dhaka. In Fisher's words, it consisted of, I quote, a map of the country contiguous to the Khasi Independent Hills estate, together with a statement of proceedings and the information collected from the definition of the boundary and the settlement of the disputes between the landholders of this district and the hill chiefs. This map is one of the earlier drafts to which corrections were made, as the margin of the image shows. In this map, the river Surma, there's the blue river sketched in the left there. In this map, the river Surma is represented as the natural boundary, while a red line along the river, in parts extending north and in parts south, sorry, I lost my spot. and in others extending south show the boundary line suggested by Fisher. The map represents the proposed boundary between Sylhet and Khasi Jaintiah hills to incorporate strategic and fertile lands along the river, whereas the hill territory also there are place names on the south of the river Surma that are marked, whereas in the north there are no place names marked at all. The map depicted topographical divisions superimposed with the imagined distinction between hills and plains. Fisher's report became the most quoted report in boundary disputes throughout the 19th century. Interestingly, the report demarcated the boundary between hills and plains using recorded dispute settlements between land proprietors in Sylhet and Khasi chiefs in the preceding decades. One such dispute was referred to in Fisher's report on lands bordering the Maharam polity, where in 1806, Bengali proprietors claimed, I quote, low hills covered with jungle. According to Fisher, the British court decided against the Bengali proprietors, quote, awarding all the continuous chain of hills branching the mountains to the Kosyas and leaving the plain country, including the detached hillocks, to the Bengali proprietors, unquote. Contradictory notions of what constituted plains territory and where the hills actually ended produced recurring disputes. Fisher's report contributed to the vagueness around the characterization of landscape. He wrote with reference to another dispute that, I quote, the foot of the mountain is acknowledged to be the boundary both by the chiefs of Muchungkunji and the inhabitants of the plains, and this rule is generally admitted along the remainder of the frontier line by the chief of Nongstoin on the side of the Kosyas and the landholders of Pargana, Laur and Bansikoran Ars. In this instance, the observation of this rule for the determination of boundary is attended with little difficulty, and there are no mirror ranges branching from the main chain of mountains, but the latter rise abruptly, abruptly, leaving in general a marked indication of their commencement. So it was hard to characterize, even for the surveyors, where the hills ended, because hillocks and undulating lands merged into Sylhet plains at variable distances. In the situation described in this quote, there was a portion of undefined land between the actual mountain range and its mirror ranges. This was considered as a confirmed frontier line ending at the foot of the main chain of mountains. In reality, as the quote above demonstrates, natural boundaries, in reality, as the code above demonstrates, natural boundaries were not used as boundaries by both the CMs of Nongstoin and landholders of Bengal. It was only through political negotiations with the CMs or the chiefs that the confirmation of boundary was at all possible. And in many cases, such negotiations also remained unresolved. So Bengali zamindars or landholders in Sylhet and their subjects were employed to police boundaries that were demarcated by Fisher's survey. They were compensated for their efforts to maintain a distinction between British and non-British territory. In addition, physical markers such as masonry pillars were constructed along the boundary line with reference to a grant made to the zamindars of Sylhet to lands north of the river Surma. Fisher wrote that the grant was made, quote unquote, on condition of defending the frontier and confining Kosyas to their mountains. So colonial territorialization was the purpose behind confining Khasis as hill tribals. In the thick of this correspondence, it is easy to find evidence for the same. There are more instances of correspondence letters exchanged between colonial officials that kind of confirm this artificial distinction being drawn between Khasis as belonging to the hills and British territory extending as far into the plains north of the river Surma. I'm going to skip reading over the quotes here. Processes of spatialization accompanied the categorization of Khasis as hill tribals and sharpening differences between Bengali inhabitants of the plains and those of the polities. The ambiguity of boundaries between hills and plains became a recurring concern for the government of Bengal, and boundary disputes between the chiefs of Nongstoin and the Zamindars in 1844, 53, and 62 demonstrate the inability to impose a strict or rigid boundary line. There also existed groups described as a mixed race, quote unquote, mixed race of Bengalis and Khasis in the foothills. These are mentioned in the earliest reports by the administrators of Sylhet. And interestingly, 19th century records on boundary demarcation are completely silent about the existence of these mixed races. Where the hills really ended would continue to destabilize the empire's sovereign status in the region, but where geographic categorizations failed, ethnic differences were employed as a means of determining difference between the British and non-British territories. So that's my second point, which is dividing the Khasis Hills and the Garo Hills district. Was it ethnic separation or spatial strategy? In 1870, the government of India ordered the suspension of ongoing topographical surveys of hill districts in the northeast frontier for financial reasons. This caused great consternation in regional and local official circles. With pressure from the government of Bengal and the Surveyor General of India, the suspension was rescinded in part, and survey operations were continued in the Khasi and Garo Hills. In a letter from letter to the Commissioner of Cooch Behar district in Bengal, Alexander Mackenzie, who was the secretary to the government of Bengal in the Judicial Department, revealed what the true nature of these survey operations were. He said that the primary object and motive behind the topographical survey was to separate the Khasi and Garo Hills. This would not be achieved, he said, until the independent, I quote, independent Garo circle in the center of the hills was brought into subjection. The Garo Hills had largely been annexed early in the 19th century with a few independent pockets. Demarcating boundaries between the Garos and the Khasis had not been discussed by colonial officials in any detail before this time. The Khasis and Garos were understood as distinct based on the language spoken by people of the two groups. However, again, in the villages at the cusp of the Garo and Khasi districts, many dialects presented a mixed form of the two languages. And most significantly, sovereignty along the villages in the boundary between the two were also understood as shared and divisible between the different chiefs. The boundary between the Garo and the Khasi Hills, which topographically were part of a single chain, was initially designed for administrative convenience. While large parts of Garo Hills were under direct administration, the Khasi Hills continued to remain autonomous. The indeterminacy among people defined as Garo about who they considered their sovereign head caused persistent unrest among colonial officials who were unable to define colonial sovereignty in clear terms. In these bordering villages, inhabitants owed their allegiance and paid tribute to the chief of Nongstoin and the chief of Ramrai, two polities which extended into Khasi Hills, Bengal, and the Garo Hills. Existing practices of recognizing both Siams as sovereign heads seemed unacceptable to colonial officials, and an emphasis on demarcating a line suggesting the limits of the respective Siams' jurisdiction is clearly seen in these records. The rearrangement of boundaries sought to create a singular definition of sovereignty based on ethnic and jurisdictional divisions. Dual jurisdiction was established in those villages at the border whose inhabitants owed allegiance and taxes to the Khasi Siams, but fell within the newly defined Garo Hills boundary. And by dual jurisdiction, I mean that a British officer, a British magistrate, would be present to oversee the working of mainly judicial and legislative proceedings. The colonial government ensured that in the subjection of these villages, the whole process of boundary demarcation was a military project. But they made sure that in the subjection of these villages, Khasis were not employed, I quote, for offensive purposes or in any other capacity than as coolies, unquote. Apart from militarily subjugating independent pockets in the Garo Hills, other strategies were used to quell resistance, such as the closure of market centers. The colonial state also employed local officials to mediate the relationship between subjects and local rulers, once again in a complex attempt to distinguish both territory and sovereignty. The process of establishing these boundaries depended on the participation of the chiefs or Siams of Rambrai and Nongstoin. They were present in these village darbars or people's councils summoned by the colonial government. In these gatherings, information on new boundaries and new revenue arrangements were announced. The presence of the Siams precluded the possibility of large-scale resistance, which the colonial state had encountered in several occasions, and it also legitimized these new sort of decisions about boundaries and the new divisions. In 1873, the Commissioner of Assam wrote a pressing letter to the Deputy Commissioner of the Khasi Hills, urging the necessity of completing the boundary between Garo Hills and Khasi Hills. Describing the preparations he had undertaken for the demarcation of the boundary, the district commissioner stated that he had placed military units of the native infantry at the border of the Khasi Garo Hills. His letter also highlighted intentions such as securing routes of communication fit for official travel between the district headquarters in Shillong and the border areas. In another letter from the Commissioner of Assam, the district commissioner emphasized the need for quote-unquote disconnecting the Garos from the Khasis. The perceived difficulties in determining, I quote, whether a village is really Garo or Khasi, unquote, destabilized colonial sovereign status in adjoining territories. The inability to identify certain villages as one or the other was augmented by the fact that British subjects like the Assamese, another quote-unquote ethnic group, do not distinguish between Garos and Khasis in speaking of the people of the low hills south of Nongstoin, but always cast them as Garos, unquote. The colonial attempt at categorizing people based on an ethnic identity that would enable a neat classification of political landscape and jurisdiction was not quite straightforward. The Siams were unable to give, at many times, they were unable to give a precise definition of which villages actually paid allegiance to them. This was translated in colonial discussion as doubts about the legitimacy of the claims of Siam's jurisdiction over the bordering villages. The ascending and descending nature of political authority in these polities was not clearly translated in colonial records or understood by colonial officials. Although the colonial officers were aware that such a system of shared sovereignty had existed, they stated that it was incompatible with British notions of sovereignty. A claim made by an official in 1863 was restated by the district commissioner in 1873, and this memorandum quoted, "I suspect the real explanation of the matter in these states have whether they felt themselves strong enough, levied blackmail upon them, No doubt the authority of the Khasi Raja is little more than nominal, but it is highly desirable that those communities should be assigned to him who acknowledge his rule and speak the Khasiya language. The great importance of having a well-defined boundary, the people living on one side of which will be subject to your jurisdiction, and those on the other to the Rajas of Nongstoin and Ramrai. For I believe both claim to the northeast must be borne in mind. This statement carried the justification for the violent subjugation of resistance to the reconstitution of boundaries. Ruler-subject relations in these villages that were characterized by irregular exaction of taxes in cash or kind was dubbed as blackmail. The shared sovereignty of Siems of Ramrai and Nongstoin was dismissed. In an attempt to lay down an quote-unquote authoritative boundary, principles such as language or natural geographic features were to be relied upon. As pointed earlier, such principles were insufficient in classifying inhabitants of the hills. Additionally, as the case of Sylhet, in the Khasi-Garo border, several villages consisted of people known as lingams who were produced, quote-unquote, produced by the intermarriage of Khasis and Garos. 49 villages were identified as inhabited by lingams under the jurisdiction of Nongstoin. The memorandum contained a short description of their social and cultural attributes, both seen as combining elements of Garo and Khasi societies. The lingams challenged the efforts of the British to confine and sedentarize inhabitants in the hills, and particularly in British Garo territories. These groups were described as, I quote, very nomadic in their habits and rarely live long on the same village site, unquote. This further increased the need to contain their jurisdictional limit. The memorandum stated that there were villages where both Siems of Nongstoin and Ramrai, I quote, had long exercised rights of very trifling value, nomadic, and 1 year maybe on one side of the boundary, the next year on the other. According to the memorandum, the collection of dues described as blackmail was acceptable to the Garo subjects because that by doing so they could enjoy comparative immunity and escape all control and avoid the more direct and searching government which they would be liable to under the Deputy Commissioner of the Garo Hills. These villages ascribed to the elusive lingams were stripped from the jurisdiction of the Khasi chiefs and brought under direct control of the British. And the Siem of Nongstoin was awarded a few other villages to compensate for the loss of these 49 villages. So the creation of ethnic and jurisdictional boundaries dividing the Khasi and Garo hills was undergirded by the same motives identifiable in the production of spatial divisions between the hills and plains. The definition of sovereignty, whether at the frontier of Sylhet and the Khasi hills or in the bordering villages of the Garo and Khasi hills, eluded colonial officials. This created persistent anxieties in defining ruler-subject relations, as well as in establishing the crown in the second half of the 19th century as the dominant sovereign power. Direct annexation of the Khasi hills had been ruled out, but military initiatives had incrementally included more and more frontier lands under British territory, often under the pretext of topographical surveys. Yet, indeterminate jurisdictional boundaries, the imprecise contours of the relationship between the colonial state and Khasi chiefs and his subjects, as well as the nature of the Siem sovereignty, created unease among both local authorities and those in the higher echelons of the state. I'm going to quickly conclude my paper. The colonial government was keen on marking the western limits of the Khasi Siem's jurisdiction once the colonial jurisdiction in the Garo Hills was extended to certain independent pockets. There was a desire to avoid any future conflicts on jurisdiction that may arise because of undetermined boundaries. Boundaries were also were the site upon which the colonial state felt most vulnerable and where its legitimacy was most uncertain. Here, new imperial knowledge, geographic knowledge being the most prominent, produced the British as the dominant political authority. The interactions between the Khasi chiefs and the East India Company demonstrate different colonial incentives, not purely based on extractive revenue economy. Similarly, relations between the colonial state and the inhabitants of the Khasi polities cannot be understood as produced out of the company's interest in land revenue. So what was the nature of ruler-subject relations and of colonial sovereignty in these extra-imperial spaces? In the unknown and unfamiliar territories that lay beyond previous Mughal acquisitions of Bengal, the East India Company employed a framework aimed at solidifying, extending, and exerting its role as the territorial sovereign in Bengal in order to make the foundations of British political supremacy legible to its subjects in directly controlled territories. Colonial officials introduced formulations of imperial sovereignty vis-a-vis extra imperial spaces. These formulations were challenged by existing ideas of shared sovereignty and notions of kinship and a complex set of socio-religious and political meanings which define sovereignty in Khasi polities. Interruptions to colonial sovereignty were contended with by domesticating the landscape and its inhabitants through new knowledge and by extending colonial jurisdiction, as we've seen in this paper. What emerges through this research is the close association between topographical and legal discourse. The construction of the inhabitants in these autonomous polities as hill tribals correspond with their confinement in the hills. An association between people and landscape characterized colonial knowledge throughout the 19th century. Scientific approaches represented landscapes, plants, rocks, and quote-unquote tribal inhabitants as quantifiable data. On the one hand, meanings attributed to socio-political and religious formations connected these tribals to a universal abstract primitive. On the other, inhabitants of non-British territories, like the Khasi Hills, were identified as cultural, not political subjects. Such classification and identification helped to formulate colonial sovereignty and continues to enhance the national sovereign status in India's frontier. Thank you.
We just hold our questions for the second paper and the comments. Okay, our second presenter is Erin Mandzak here. Let's get started.
This paper is a synopsis of the first chapter of my thesis, a chapter that I've discovered covered more thematic and temporal ground than I had initially allotted for it. I'm thus very interested to hear your feedback, as I think this chapter is representative of the many tensions that I've found in the themes that I cover throughout my dissertation, tensions between the histories of two ex-colonies of the British Empire, both of which have been overwhelmed by the histories of the two resident superpowers in the United States and Great Britain. Finally, this paper will reveal the tensions in bridging cultural, post-colonial, critical race histories and methods of analysis, fields that I have been trained in, with the more traditional Canadian fields of political and economic history. At the outset, I was eager to take on what I posited to be a relationship between the material and the symbolic interests of the state, to analyze the ways in which one engendered the other. The trade in commodities has famously connected the histories of Canada and the West Indian colonies in the triangular trade that saw cod, lumber, and other staples traveling south, sugar, rum, molasses, and spices flowing north, and thus seemed a natural place to begin. I quickly, however, discovered through secondary and primary source analysis that commodity trade between the two regions in the 20th century was a failing venture. Yet many prominent Canadian political and business figures and most popular sources of the early 20th century told a different story. As a result, I was faced with a narrative that, on the surface, was riddled with material failure, but was resilient in the consistency of its symbolism. I would like to begin with a quote from Thomas Bassett Macaulay, president of Sun Life Insurance and co-founder of the Canadian West Indian League. The fact, quote, "The fact in trade matters, that in trade matters, your colonies and Canada are ideally complementary need hardly to be emphasized. Each produces what the other requires, each can promote the prosperity of the other. It may now be taken as an axiomatic that the future of the British West Indies and the future of Canada are inseparably bound together." End quote. In this quotation, Macaulay referred to the primary tenets of trade mutualism, that participating trading partners produce what the other requires and thus cannot produce for itself, and furthermore, said trade does not affect the capacities of one's national industries. During one of the worst years of the Depression, T.B. Macaulay, speaking on behalf of the Canadian West Indies League, wrote these words to the governor of Jamaica, Sir Reginald E. Stubbs. At a time that was beset with fears of irreparable economic collapse, his prose reads strikingly definitive and his tone oddly reassured. Macaulay presents his subject matter as self-evident, and yet even in this short passage, one gets the sense that he is attempting to argue a position or persuade a skeptic. This passage hints at one of the fundamental questions that my thesis asks, which is how had the inseparable bonds of Canadian West Indian commercial relations become an axiomatic? And why was it imperative that they be pursued in the gregarious fashion exhibited in most of its promotion? In this chapter of this paper, I will take up these questions, but also investigate how trading relations were promoted and who sought to promote them. Ultimately, I'm interested in the implications of trade, how these relations were connected to the modernizing project of the Canadian nation-state, and finally, in what ways did such transnational flows shape future relations between Canada and the Caribbean. Through posing such questions in this paper, I argue that the change in trade relations over time cannot be effectively understood as simply waxing and waning, improving and faltering. This is because the quantifiable terms of trade between the regions do not help us fully understand the way prospects of trade were imagined, discussed, and popularized by public servants, government officials, businessmen, and the media. Trade figures are also insufficient in explaining how the channels of trade and the content of those channels prefigured and shaped the nature of relations in the future. In other words, by only studying the numerical data of trade and the literature that surrounds the economic value or success of trade relations, one only gleans a partial dimension of the trading process. As Mimi Schellert reminds us, commodity trade with the Caribbean has historically elicited, quote, an attendant extension and proliferation of forms of consumption as Caribbean landscapes, flora and fauna, bodies and labor, images and cultural objects. It is not only goods which circulated in the transatlantic world economy, but also people, texts, images, desires, and attachments, end quote. I will explore the attendant narratives of nation and empire produced through Canada's trade with the Caribbean and examine the implications of Canadian representatives' pursuance of the Caribbean. In this paper, I will begin by looking at three prominent Canadian figures who helped make Canada's mutual trade with the West Indies appear critical. I will then discuss how the rhetoric of trade mutualism, given its contours by racialized discourse and imagery produced about the Caribbean, was manipulated for political gain. In 1912, Borden had settled in as Prime Minister, victorious in the recent federal campaign, largely by emphasizing the fidelity of his Conservative Party to Macdonald's national policy and the British Empire, distinguishing his party from Laurier's Liberals, whose 1911 reciprocity agreement was quickly characterized as the effective selling out of Canadian manufacturers to American interests. At this time, elite Canadians had established a strong presence through business and banking ventures throughout the Caribbean and in several Latin American nations, but were unsuccessful in 2 annexation attempts on the islands of Jamaica and the Bahamas. During the period under Borden, 2 influential figures in Sir George Euless Foster and Harry Judson Crowe would profoundly shape the relationship between Canada and the Caribbean, and in direct and indirect ways promote the imperative of trade mutualism. Following decades in a variety of ministry postings, Foster was assigned the Trade and Commerce portfolio. He aligned with Borden and his imperialist leanings, and emboldened by the strong parliamentary mandate for stronger imperial bonds, initiated imperial preference trade talks and the restructuring of the Trade Commissioner Service. Foster was a unionist, but adamant that any change in the relations between the 2 imperial entities, quote, must emanate from the West India Islands themselves, end quote. He thus quickly followed up on a commission report and proposal pitched by the British Colonial Secretary and initiated the first conference operating along the lines of bound margins of preference between the 2 regions. Up until this date, West Indians had not offered Canada trade preferences as the United States remained their financial focal point, particularly for colonies whose major exports were in tropical fruits and cacao. The 1912 conference changed this pattern, even if the agreed upon terms were initially less favorable than the ones Canadians had predicted to attain. And a number of important colonies refused to participate, including Jamaica. Riding this wave of momentum produced by this unprecedented conference and responding to a litany of indictments that Canadians were too unfamiliar and cavalier with their West Indian trading partners, Foster enlisted seasoned journalist Watson Griffin to tour the British West Indies and report on the possibilities of trade under the preferential tariff agreement. Griffin's 1915 report on the heels of the 1912 conference marked a turning point of sorts, and it is important that Griffin, a journalist by trade, should be chosen to bring attention to the opportunities produced through the conference. From a strictly economic perspective, the 1912 trade agreement and its immediate trade-related aftermath were ambiguous events. While Canadian exports to the West Indies rose immediately, imports from the West Indies declined. Wartime brought upon an increase in trade on both ends of the trade spectrum, but Canada's share of the volume of trade failed to take advantage of Britain's absence during this period, and the American market ultimately profited. Griffin's extended report promoting the possibilities of trade with the British West Indies utilized the discourse of trade mutualism to describe the natural connection between the 2 regions, but from an exclusively rational geo-commercial standpoint. Absent from his report were the typical imperial sentiments and references to familial responsibilities or attachments. In fact, from the very beginning of his report, Griffin asserts the primacy of the Maritimes, and specifically the port cities of Halifax and St. John, to the trans-regional trade, citing closer distance and more practical accessibility to each other in comparison to the Maritimes and the Prairies. As an official government document sponsored by a newly expanded Trade and Commerce Department, Griffin's report on the great multitude of possible affiliations, trade and otherwise, in Canadian business Canadian business could have with the West Indies bore more significance than previous travelogues and government forays on similar subject matters. It is especially curious then that Foster should have chosen Griffin, a political outsider, for this important venture. Foster, however, valued that, quote, Griffin had a long and varied experience in industrial life in Canada and possessed the added qualifications of being a practical journalist and having an intimate knowledge of the newspaper world of Canada, end quote. These skills were put on full display in the journalist's sprawling account that went beyond providing Canadian businessmen with the necessary data to exploit the 1912 trade agreement. Partly through expert information and partly through anecdotal observations, Griffin used candid and often animated prose to describe the, quote, character of the British West Indian people. Similar to his sections on geography, Griffin prefaced his descriptions with a few images that acted to reinforce his general characterizations, producing a Caribbean picturesque of racialized West Indians for Canadian businessmen. The Caribbean picturesque, the seemingly naturally ordered, as discussed by Krista Thompson's work, was produced during the late 19th century by both British and local white elites and British and American entrepreneurs. Following the plummeting of sugar profits, these investors refashioned the imagined landscapes of the British West Indies from ones of disease and death to bastions of health and repose. Thompson's work focuses on the islands of Jamaica and the Bahamas, wherein she argues island economies were transformed to accommodate and reify the modernizing project, that of reinventing the Caribbean as a tropical tourism destination. This process was complex insofar as it set out to capture the often contradictory nature of the alluring Caribbean tropics, a space that was at once lush, exotic, and romantic, yet also orderly, safe, and promising the comforts of British American civilized society. Griffin's stated intentions were geared less towards promoting the exotic and more strictly towards establishing an orderly, business-friendly region. His report, however, makes use of racial tropes and imperial rationale not only in rendering racialized West Indians intelligible to white Canadian businessmen, but also commodifiable as trustworthy producers of Caribbean resources. The importance of this slippage between discourses was twofold. To understand West Indian business and its production was to engage with the reproduction of racial hierarchies and to render those racialized as ultimately tied to their respective islands' commodities. In this description of Indian and Black Caribbean men, Griffin seeks, in his descriptions of Indian and Black Caribbean men, Griffin seeks to both convey new knowledge to businessmen and his department on the racial landscape of the West Indies, as well as confirm some of their preconceived notions. In accordance with his imperialist leanings, Griffin also emphasized the reliability and thriftiness of the new Indian laborers, and by extension, the good sense of the British indentureship system that facilitated Indian migration and employment in the Caribbean in the 19th century. Conversely, Griffin begins his section on Afro-Caribbeans by claiming that there was some truth to the racist characterization of the bothersome idle black beggar. However, he argues such assessments are usually made by tourists who have not spent sufficient time in the Caribbean, and if one notes the amount of domestic products exported from the islands that are largely populated by Afro-Caribbeans, quote, it is evident that they must do a considerable amount of work in the course of a year, end quote. Women were largely absent from this report and only appear in discussions on sex imbalances and as decorative images. Ultimately, Griffin wants to reassure his readers that the non-white Caribbean population can be, and in certain instances has been, productive and civilized. The crux of Griffin's report culminates in a short chapter entitled Preference Without Sacrifice. The content of this chapter is as succinct as the title suggests. Canada's reciprocal trade offered a fail-proof solution to Canadian manufacturers, and this, quote, owing to difference of climate between the two regions and the subsequent rationale that we buy from them which we cannot buy at home, end quote. However, Griffin emphasized that the primary means through which a reciprocal trading scenario could be best achieved was through buying Caribbean products directly from Caribbean merchants and not through Americans. Only through direct trade could a form of mutuality be cultivated, for as it stood, colonies such as Jamaica were unaware of the extent to which Canadians consumed. For example, Jamaican bananas. The example of the Jamaican banana trade had by this time become ubiquitous. The island of Jamaica, which transformed in the late 19th century to promote the largely peasant production of bananas, changed again in the last decade as American Lorenzo Dow Baker's Boston Fruit Company, later to become known as the United Fruit Company, expanded, causing land rental rates to rise beyond the earning capacities of most banana farmers. As Thomas Holt notes, quote, by the early 20th century then, the Jamaican banana trade was controlled from production to marketing by one multinational corporation, rendering the formerly independent peasant cultivators a virtual proletariat, end quote. Thus, Jamaica, the former jewel of Britain's Caribbean empire, was by the turn of the century thoroughly infiltrated by American capital. However, the colony's many associations, such as the influential Jamaica Imperial Association, attested to the resilience of the British imperial influence on the island. It was perhaps this heady mix of steadfast imperial mindedness, threatening American capitalism, and the sheer financial possibility of the Jamaican socio-economic space that captured the imagination of fiery Nova Scotian businessman Harry Judson Crowe. An ardent and active promoter of Newfoundland union with the Canadian Dominion, he was well equipped and motivated to take on the mantle of chief antagonist for Canadian union with the British West Indies during the Borden years. Upon return from a Caribbean vacation in 1915, Crow published spirited exposés in popular newspapers and imperialist circulars to promote the union between Canada and the British West Indies. The businessman turned journalist orator focused most of his energies on the colony of Jamaica, which following the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914, he argued bore an especially strategic position at the entrance to the canal, the great pathway to trade routes between North and South America. As with the previous Canadian annexation campaign in the Bahamas, Crow sought out elite and middle-class audiences and spoke favorably about the possibilities of West Indian representation within a Canadian federation, emphasizing the threat of American capitalist might, a threat from whom Canadians could protect their imperial brethren. Utilizing well-withered discourse, Crow argued that Canadian independence from the United States was reliant upon obtaining tropical land. However, in the early interwar period, Crow's arguments for dominion control over tropical land were emboldened with the suggestion that Canada deserved such access to tropical commodities and increased responsibility in the empire in light of the Dominion's wartime contributions. Official Canadian West Indian Federation talks rose to their highest heights under Borden and through the support of Foster and Crow. Although the campaign ultimately failed in the fall of 1919, its ideals and the discourse surrounding trade connections between the two regions persisted. With the contributions of individuals like Foster, Griffin, and Crow, the beginning of the 1920s, far from signaling the downscaling of Canadian interest in the British Caribbean, brought intensified interest in strengthening Canada's position in the tropics, and particularly with Jamaica. More specifically, the interwar period saw the convergence of several political, economic, and cultural factors linking Canada and the British West Indies, about which I will only have a chance to refer to a few. These being the Maritimes rights movement and Laurier's strategic response to it, and the multi-section Special West Indian promotional series printed in 1930 in the Montreal Star, boosting the notion of the West Indies as Canada's new frontier. A number of maritime collectives, political and otherwise, formed to address what many in the region viewed as a systematic pauperization of the region, and the slogan of maritime rights arose to define a post-World War I movement set on addressing collective grievances aggravated by the consolidation of the Canadian National Railway from 1918 to 1923. As Ernest Forbes describes, the campaign could be described as a social movement, but not one that was arising from class conflict. The amorphous group was largely represented by local businessmen and professionals whose interests, alongside those of farmers and laborers, could most accurately be described as the defense of the region. The 1921 federal election offered maritime liberal leaders with the opportunity to take advantage of local animosity towards conservative decisions, such as the 1919 Railway Act. Among the most successful of these politicians were the future Prime Minister Mackenzie King, running as a representative from Prince Edward Island, and the Member of Parliament from Cumberland, Nova Scotia, Hans J. Logan, whose titles of President of the Maritime Board of Trade and the Nova Scotia Liberal Organization ensured his legitimacy as a regional defender. Once in power, King would exploit the willingness of Liberal MPs to appease their constituents and appear to have the ear of the Prime Minister. He was also cognizant that the political tables had turned with respect to the party's position vis-a-vis the opposition on the matter of maritime rights. Subsequently, in the approaches of the next election, after showing blatant favoritism to the prairie provinces, King accepted a maritime plan of action presented by a refreshed Logan, whose vacation time in the Bahamas had given him a renewed sense of the Caribbean's importance to Canada. King was convinced by Logan's remedy for the economic woes facing the Maritimes, and sent the outspoken MP on a winter-long expedition to, quote, investigate the trade conditions and to invite representatives of the British West Indies to Canada to discuss a new trade agreement. In a call to the people of the maritime provinces, Logan recounted, quote, I only wish I could awaken the people of the maritime provinces to the possibilities of the West Indies and the republics. Other parts of Canada are awakening to these possibilities. The chairman of a meeting held in St. John's, Quebec, a few evenings ago, as reported by the Montreal Star, said, quote, with steadily improving trade conditions, the manufacturers of Canada are gazing out across the horizon towards the prosperous republics of South America and the islands of the Atlantic Ocean, with the same pioneer vision with regard to the development of commerce that Columbus and his fellow explorers had for the discovery of the New Worlds, end quote. The riches of the Indies script had evidently retained much of its allure, and the financial costs in its pursuance were marginalized as a necessary means to attaining national consensus and imperial unity. Emerging out of Logan's expedition, as well as West Indian pressure to improve Canadian shipping, was the Trade Agreement of 1925, which would profoundly shape the nature of Canadian trade with the West Indies for the next 20 years. While there was some skepticism regarding Logan's claim of near infinite possibilities for trade expansion, official Canadian proposal for significant trade extension and their emphasis on promoting trade for the benefit of the maritime provinces suggest that Canadian officials were at least inclined to support the basic premise that West Indian trade was potentially profitable economically and politically. The most important concession to come out of the 1925 discussions, was Canada's promise to provide a properly equipped shipping fleet and the colony's agreement to pay subsidies for such a service. Canadian National Steamships, a subsidiary of the CNR, provided the government with the most acceptable tender and was subsequently awarded the rights towards heading up the Canadian West Indies service. Nicknamed the Lady Boats, these 5 ships were named after the wives of famous British admirals and were conceptualized and promoted to elicit maximum fanfare for the Dominion, Empire, and the Imperial romance connecting Canada to the West Indies. Similar sentiments were present in the closing session of trade talks, as the chairman, Lowe, stated, quote, we are met here for the purpose of trying to extend our trade relations. But I think perhaps something far greater has been accomplished, and that is we have done much to bind the empire together. We in Canada shall carry with us in the years to come a most pleasant recollection of your visit to our country. I believe that this will do very much to cement empire than a mere matter of dollars and cents as involved in trade, end quote. Such sanctimony angered the trade agreement's most vocal critics, the West India Committee of the Halifax Board of Trade. Shortly after the summer's meetings, members of this subcommittee committed their dissent for future expenditures on West Indian trade to a report. In meticulous detail, the report outlined a cost-benefit analysis that concluded overwhelmingly in the former with respect to reliance on trade with the West Indies. Namely, committee members argued that flour preferences were unnecessary towards improving its trade volume, that the British colony of Newfoundland would continue to undercut Canadian export prices to the Caribbean, especially in the export of salted cod, that the more cost-efficient and expedient system for importing bananas to Ontario and West Canada was not direct import, but was by ways of the waterways of New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama, and on through the railways. The maritime trade in the fruit would, they contended, no doubt be infiltrated by small private steamers. Ultimately, they concluded that the American and British prerogatives would dictate the flow of commercial traffic and that large capital expenditures on ships would merely lead to more deficits for Canada within this trading system. The report is remarkable in its isolation, as no other faction was so resolutely against the extension of trading preferences with the British West Indies as this board of maritimers, whose regional and professional experience suggests that they would have greater insight than most into the matter at hand. The Halifax Board of Trade's predictions ignored by the federal government largely came true. Certainly, the onset of the Depression years abetted the descent of what was already a risky venture in the West Indies trade. However, the history of Canada's attempt to import her own bananas illustrates just how well the Halifax Board understood the politics of commodity trade in the Caribbean basin. Direct banana shipment into Canada went into official effect in 1929. According to the presiding governor of Jamaica, Reginald Stubbs, following United Fruit Company's owned Fruit Dispatch Company exclusive space on Canadian ships would, quote, sacrifice the principal advantage which Jamaica expects to obtain from the new service, the release of the Jamaican producers from the domination of the United Fruit Company, and would reduce to an almost negligible point the prospects of increased imports from Canada, end quote. With respect to the latter part of the statement, Stubbs contended that, quote, the purchasing power of the Jamaican producer was a foremost concern of the colonial government and should indeed be considered a priority of the Canadian government. In order to effectively achieve this tenuous idea of release, the colonial government supported the Jamaican Banana Producers Association, or the JBPA, exclusive rights to the new Canadian West Indies banana cargo space. The JBPA and the Canadian trade in Jamaican bananas followed parallel lines of development. In 1925, the Banana Cooperative took shape through the financial and legal support of the Jamaican government and funds from the new Colonial Development Fund. And in 1929, the JBPA officially began its operations. As Thomas Holt notes, despite some initial success at providing small peasant holdings with better access to the global markets, the JBPA capitulated to the immense financial and political pressures leveled on its organization by the UFC and the Great Economic Depression of the 30s. Furthermore, Holt argues that with a monopoly over fruit production and the distribution in Jamaica as well as Central America, the UFC had maintained an authoritative position in the ideological economic circles of Jamaica and Great Britain. Quote, only the potential for popular unrest, should it openly abandon the JBPA, cause the government to moderate its favoritism towards United, end quote. More than 10 years after the 1925 trade agreement was lauded as a great mechanism in intra-imperial mutualism, Deputy Minister of the Department of Trade and Commerce, James Parmley, revealed just how naive the Canadian government was with respect to political economic pressures at play in Jamaica and the relative superfluousness of trade mutualism with Canadians. In a 1937 letter to the Department of Transport, Parmley recounted with great annoyance the unilateral actions taken by the Jamaican legislature to reallocate 80% cargo holding space originally assigned to the JBPA to the UFC. Such an act was indicative, Parmley asserted, of a government that was not sensitive to the interconnectedness of the trading network shared by the two political bodies, and the effects drastic changes to said relationship would take, but was also demonstrative of a generally ungrateful Jamaican government. Canada sustained great losses following the 1925 trade agreement and up through until the Second World War. However, as an astute commentator noted in 1931 in the Daily Gleaner, Jamaica's Daily Gleaner, Canada's direct importation of bananas did not lend to greater consumption of bananas, but merely the rerouting of banana sales away to a limited extent from the American market. Rather, Canada's preference with respect to West Indian sugar was of supreme importance to Jamaica and other Caribbean colonies, as the American market had effectively shut them out. In other words, the alterations to commodity pathways in and of themselves, regardless of their well-meaning intentions, would not help Jamaica. Popular representations of Canadian West Indian trade during the post-war period and following the 1925 trade agreement largely reinforced the support and positive prognostications made by Canadian state officials, civil servants, and businessmen. Two examples I will speak to, and I will speak to just one in this presentation, demonstrate how, through the conduits of extended and popularized trade relations, new transnational relations could be produced using the old structures of empire and the new modern signifiers of tourism. The special edition format in the popular Montreal English newspaper, the Montreal Star, and later the Gazette, provided their readership with information on the opportunities and luxuries that the West Indies had to offer, whilst also describing the steps that the federal government was taking to ensure easy access to the tropics. These sections, both included during the fall-winter seasons, when presumably tropical imagery would appear all the more inviting, relied heavily on the power of images to introduce Canadians to the British West Indies. In didactic and dutiful fashion, the Montreal Star began the first of their 5 West Indian sections by informing their readership of their publication's, quote, practical interest in the relationship of Canada and the British West Indies, end quote, a relationship they deemed could be improved and would be only through the ripening of acquaintances between businessmen in the two regions. At the outset, these Star sections were mostly geared towards attracting the attention of men in the business and manufacturing worlds, as articles emphasized the prestigious positions of the male contributors. Interspersed amongst articles detailing commodity trade statistics and West Indian infrastructure projects were lighter interest pieces on the raw and or rural tropical commodities of the Caribbean. These pieces were often simply large images with extended captions that usually featured native laborers alongside or engaged in the production of transportation of commodities in the initial stages of production. While the image of black laborers in plantation settings were not part of white Canadians' collective historical memory in the way that it was for Americans, the Montreal Star pictures relied in part on what racialized imagery had already established. Critical race theorists and historians of the African American experience have thoroughly analyzed how images of blackness have been manipulated to perform for and cater to white desires pre and post emancipation, particularly in relation to the selling of commodities. Grace Elizabeth Hale notes that, quote, not just African labor, but the commercialization of their racist representation could be turned into white profit, end quote. Such racially charged advertisements and minstrel imagery were not exclusively circulated in the United States, making their way across the Canadian border with ease during the 19th and 20th centuries. One classic example of this phenomenon was the wildly popular Aunt Jemima, quote, whose popularity Hale suggests resulted not only from her pancakes, but also from her capacity to embody the black as entertainment, labor, and product, end quote. As Sarah Jane Matthew has illustrated in her work, Black Porters, the connection between servility and blackness was also reinscribed in the jobs that were made available to black men and women in Canada in the late 19th century and throughout the first half of the 20th. Thus, white Canadians during the early 20th century would have associated black men and women with menial labor, among other racist tropes. The images and instructive captions like this one, and several others like it, entitled Preparing Coconuts for Market, and which states, coconuts sold in Canada are imported from Jamaica where the industry flourishes, while the desiccated coconut used in the decoration of cakes and in other delicacies is made here in Montreal from the nuts brought in from Jamaica. The coconut passes through many processes before it appears in stores here, end quote. These served additional purposes. They signified the exotic and erotic qualities of the West Indies through the emphasis on tropical fruits and the fecundity of the land. The presence of black women and occasionally men, either strategically posed or immersed in the commodity being described, confirmed that the colonial economies were disciplined and productive. Surrounded by articles discussing Canadian initiatives in the Caribbean, the ultimate purpose of these images is not one that affixes the tropical subjects, be they commodities or people, to the space of the tropics, but is one that seeks to bind the tropics to Canadian markets, and set amidst numerous tourist advertisements, bind Canadians' vacationing experiences to the tropics of the West Indies. By emphasizing the transformation of tropical commodities to goods suitable for the Canadian household, West Indian goods were given value through the labor that extracted them from their original primitive form, and moreover, the imperial auspices of mutual trade between Dominion and colony through which said labor was enabled to transport raw goods to the manufacturing houses in Montreal. And to conclude, the incorporation of the West Indies as an ideal new frontier for Canada during the Depression, a frontier understood to be replete with willing laborers producing goods that Canada as an aspiring modern nation needed, fit well within Prime Minister Bennett's protectionist strategy of promoting imperial trade in the 30s. Canada consistently lost money in this venture, and West Indian governments routinely complained that their subsidy payments were too high in relation to what Canadian trade and shipping services offered their respective economies. However, for both parties, the other represented political possibilities. For the West Indian governments, Canada could be appealed to when American businesses applied unwanted pressure. The West Indies prefigured as a space requiring white leadership, where labor was cheap, and following early 20th century developments where the ultimate tourist experience could be had, became for Canada a space for seemingly endless possibilities. Thank you.
I'll now ask Professor Hussain to provide comments, and maybe I can also ask Erin and Reeju to come and sit here in front so that you can take the question.
Well, people haven't come to really hear me talk about the papers, and I think what would be much more interesting is for our presenters and for you is to have an opportunity for discussion and questions to them. So I will just dispense with most of the ways in which I would try to elegantly show how both the two papers have, which I was encouraged to do by this man I had in mind to do. So I have 3 or 4 of those, but these are papers that deserve to stand on their own, and that while they do a lot of things together in connection, I have kind of some questions, maybe just to start off our discussion for each of them. And they're both very multi-layered presentations that do a lot of different things, and I also felt that both of them telescope a lot in their conclusion, because they're obviously part of much larger projects, and how it connects to that larger project happens in those conclusions. So maybe in a way I'd rather just give them an opportunity, perhaps on a couple key issues, a chance to maybe elaborate some of those connections that they clearly are thinking about, but they're very implicit, or maybe more implicit because of the abbreviated nature of these
extracts from their larger projects and work. So for Reeju, I guess my main sort of question, I guess, is that clearly reconceptualizing the meaning of indirect rule is the big historiographical impact. As somebody who's totally outside of both of these fields and knows nothing, I can say that at least that's something that even I had heard about as a significant historiographical issue. I wondered how, if you could maybe elaborate a little, how you see your perspective of the history of this frontier reframing what's claimed is the purported difference between direct and indirect rule and what some of the consequences and implications are. How that way of organizing, it's a comment on sovereignty. So since your paper is about that, I thought maybe you could bring that out further. I guess one sub-question is if you could explain a little bit more about the local ideas about sovereignty. You mentioned that they're shared and divisible, and that the colonial administrators don't necessarily understand it, and they certainly can't kind of describe it in a way that fits with notions they want to promote. But I was thinking, if you could elaborate a little bit what those are and how maybe those are being shaped by this interaction with the British. And I think that case of the blackmail, that quote where you mentioned blackmail, irregular exactions being described as blackmail when clearly what it is perhaps some adjustment to the fact that it's in the interests of both of these two groups to pay some irregular exaction to the chiefs so that they don't have to fall under British kind of control. So maybe that tactic itself it might be a way to help elucidate for us what the local sovereignty is. So there's more, and we could talk at length, but let me move to a question or two for Erin, which is, again, right there at the end. I thought, it seems like your study can go one of two ways. One is to explore, as you did in most of the paper, the way in which Canadian political figures and are trying to portray the value of this trade and the need for it for various ideological and political and maybe cultural discourse that has value beyond the trade itself, and how that plays into some kind of contestation of Canadian national identity. So one dimension is, well, you only mentioned the Halifax case as trade group being a Board of Commerce being a complete outlier in saying, look, this doesn't make any sense financially or economically. Were there other contestations that maybe rewrote this relationship? Didn't necessarily appeal. You mentioned at the outset that you're interested in kind of the way this fit into a sense of Canada's modernizing state project. Wouldn't it have been modernizing to say, look, the imperial alignments don't make that much sense, that's an outmoded way, we have to kind of adapt to commerce in the kind of Western Hemisphere here, and what would that have meant in terms of Canada-Caribbean relations? So I don't know if that's a relevant question at all, but that's one direction. The other direction was how it, in terms of some kind of transnational, if trade mutualism there really isn't that much trade that's significant. Nonetheless, your paper seems to suggest that there's a lot of discourse about trade mutualism that certainly from the Canadian side is very significant, but you alluded at the end that Caribbean political figures sometimes bought into this to appeal to this relationship when they had problems with the Americans. So I'm wondering, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how this looks from the Caribbean perspective. How do they respond to this Canadian enthusiasm for claiming that we should all be part of the empire because of this great trading relationship that we should have? And how would you characterize that? If there's no trade mutualism, at least it seems perhaps you're alluding to some kind of shared discourse on trade mutualism that has some consequence. So anyway, I'll just leave it with those, and hope I've given you some time and others to ask a few questions.
Should we address
Oh, and I should say you're welcome to not take up those and just take questions from the audience. I will certainly not be, concerned if those are for you to think about.
Very quickly, I think what you just mentioned, Professor Hussain, is what I'm trying to formulate is how does colonialism operate in these autonomous polities, where I find the description or the definition of indirect rule rather insufficient. Mainly in South Asian historiography, indirect rule has been used to study princely states, or those regions which were not directly annexed by the colonial British state, and were left, they would usually employ one officer in the court of the prince or the chief, and that person would negotiate diplomatic relations of the princely states with other states. So some of the ways in which indirect rule operated was that the British would only would have some investment in economy, but not a lot, and largely maintain some interference in the relation between one polity or princely state and another. Another difference is the difference between ruler-subject relations. So there were revenue-yielding subjects in the directly held territories as opposed to non-revenue-yielding subjects of the princely states or these autonomous polities. In my study, when I approached it, this was my first this is the first distinction I made. And one would assume that the relative autonomy in indirectly ruled sort of regions would accord a certain difference in the subjectivity or subject formation in these regions, and that the effect of colonialism would be much more tame or reduced. Whereas I found that particularly through the operations of colonial knowledge formation, there were tons and tons of geographical accounts, a lot of anthropological and ethnographic accounts, geological, I mean, you name it, there were just all kinds of scientific studies being conducted in these autonomous territories and the frontier, which ultimately sort of sought to domesticate a region that seemed dangerous or that seemed unfamiliar. And as they were never, these polities were never annexed, never even described as British territory, and yet there were colonial structures of knowledge that permeated them. So I've been trying to, I guess, formulate how one can understand the operations of that kind of colonialism, particularly now that the Indian state has incorporated these autonomous spaces into the Indian Union, and there is a lot of sort of contestation between groups in these regions and the Indian state. So how does one, and again, the Indian state operates through autonomous district councils that are run by people from these regions. And it's still a question I don't think I've been able to answer yet, but I feel like indirect rule as a category or as a concept is not really able to fully address the problems. About local ideas of sovereignty, these polities that I described are matrilineal, they follow a matrilineal kinship system, where unfortunately, before I answer unfortunately, there is a problem of records, because the only written documents, the earliest written documents are the ones that one finds through the colonial archive. So, how these low polities really operated in the pre-colonial period can only be read through those records and through, of course, oral sources and oral traditions. So to answer the question about local ideas, these have a matrilineal kinship system and shared ideas of sovereignty, whereby a lot of sort of villages or a lot of inhabitants often would kind of owe their allegiance to multiple or at least one or two different chiefs. And chiefs would often, even collection of taxes was not something that, through my research on oral traditions, I found that land was not understood as property. And there was a more communal understanding of land. There was common land, which yielded whatever resources was commonly held by these villages. So kinship system and this shared nature of owing allegiance to authority is what I found very different. And these kind of also transform over the course of the 19th century, particularly in the gendered authority that emerges. So there are instances of women who were chiefs, etc., which obviously, over the course of the 19th century, completely disappear from the records. And in terms of the way that the operations or the way that rulers or chiefs chiefly authority was reconstituted, one finds many examples of the manipulation of the existence of colonial power and engagement with colonial power in order to augment their own authority. So I'm not going to take up more time, but
okay, I guess in terms of other contestations, factions that were against this trade, it was largely a conversation between Eastern Canada including, I guess, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces, and the British Caribbean. So at this point, so there really isn't any other voice contesting the trade. And in terms of, I guess, this idea of developing a more modern country still through imperial auspices, I think it was still popular, and you only see this kind of attempt to merge more with American interests after the Depression, but still kind of within the fold of the British, because they're still like largely connected to them economically. Trade mutualism was something that did have some material grounding, as you know, Canada was there for the Caribbean several times before the triangular trade kind of helps define this initial idea of having mutual trade, the mutual interests in the two regions. But a lot of these sort of mutual trade operations that work out are not these sort of national state processes. They're largely ones that are not, they don't have a lot of funding, and that's why the Maritimes, they know that these small fleets are going to undercut them every time. There's a sort of famous rum run that happens in the 20s and 30s that is largely undercutting a lot of the trade. And so these sort of more extra-legal operations or smaller operations are what are profitable between the two regions, not these ones that are sort of given a lot of state funding. And so there is sort of, I guess, material grounding, as I said, to this idea of trade mutualism. In terms of sort of larger state instances, I couldn't talk about it in the presentation, but William Fielding, who was the finance minister at the end of the century, or at the turn of the 19th century and 20th century, does sort of, in part, save the Caribbean with helping them with the sugar trade when the Americans sort of side with the Latin Caribbean and Pacific countries. So you do have that instance where Canada is seen as sort of a chief or an important trading partner. With the language, though, I think that it is largely exploited for political reasons. And that's what I kind of tried to show in the presentation. Even sort of post the period that I talk about, you often see the Caribbean, and largely now in the 40s and 50s, you have West Indians leading governments using this idea of Canada being an option, someone that they can appeal to, someone that they can compare to the Americans as being perhaps more democratic, less racist, without a colonial history, et cetera, so that they could perhaps sort of have immigration access and try to bend sort of strict tariff policies. So Canada is often used just as Canada uses the Caribbean. Not obviously similarly, and you still have an asymmetrical relationship between the two, but there is this kind of use of an idea that these two political bodies are part of some sort of British Empire. They're not equal partners, even though, once the West Indies develop their own nations, they try to sort of put themselves at level with Canada. So.